but some other distinct materials or atoms or whatever matter is taking the exact form that you did as you laid in bed. And then it woke up. Is that separate from you? All right, so in this video, I'm going to try and tackle Destiny's identity dilemma. To start, we've got a beautiful picture of goats. So I'll be cutting together the clips in chronological order, going through the problems, and I think at the very end of this document, I finally got to what, like the real like core sentiment that Destiny was wondering over. So I'm hoping possibly that it can further the discussion on that little bit. So there's two questions that Destiny starts with the little clipping question from his video. The first one is, who are you? And the second one is, who do you exist as?
The concept of identity is like really rough. Like, who are you, or who do you exist as?
Now, I answer these questions, I think tautologically is the correct way to say it, but when we ask, who are you? When we ask that question, there's an answer inside of the question itself. So what I state is, whatever definition that you use when you're asking the question of you, we assume then is the answer to the question, right? So when someone asks, who are you? It has to be some kind of definition of you, right? Like they're asking, who are you? What is the concept of that word? And my response is very simple. You are you. So whatever definition they use for you, I'm just going to respond with you, because obviously, like, I'm not trying to like trick anyone here. This is just, one of those questions where it's impossible to answer. Who are you? Well, we have to get the definition of like, of all the different possibilities of what you can mean. Practically, you is useful only as a signifier of our own self. Now, self itself is also a word that is very difficult to define in any discrete way. What that self is and how we experience, or if we even experience anything that is the self, are their own impossible to answer questions, right? So as we delve deeper into what you are, we start to realize that we're only getting more and more questions. They cannot be answered because we're searching for a single entity within a transient system that is comprised of trillions of interacting components. So this is kind of the practical solution here, the practical answer of like, look, the reality is that as human beings, we are these immensely complicated systems that have like, so when you're doing algebra as a kid, right, you're working with very simple systems like y equals mx plus b. You've got two variables, y and x, and you can predict the system very easily because you know all of the variables. Now let's say I asked you to solve an algebraic expression that had a trillion different variables within it, and all of them were interacting with one another in a way that wasn't as simple as addition or multiplication. Solving that kind of problem and finding some sort of formula that answers every different scenario into another scenario is practically impossible. So that's what this answer means. It means that when we get down to like the physical reality of what we are, there's no the answer is as complicated as the universe itself. The word you means an infinite number of things, which are all true given specific assumptions. So my statement here is that you can have you mean any number of things so long as you have the proper assumptions to support that. And when we go over the is it immoral to kill someone who is sleeping, it becomes a lot clearer how we can make many different assumptions given different things that we accept as one form or another, right? Because in philosophy, everything kind of breaks itself down because you realize that like what is a form and like how do we define something as one thing versus any other thing. And that's why any definition just breaks down into a million different questions. So therefore, to get an answer, you'll have to ask an infinite number of questions. Okay, so too long didn't read. There's an infinite number of answers to these good questions. Because you is a variable that can mean almost anything under some specific set of assumptions that you assign to it. All of these definitions of this word you are simply painting a more precise picture of what the form of you really is, like objectively. But the reality is that that form is so complex, or this term of you encompasses so many things, and so many of those things are reliant on other definitions that we ourselves have to make up, that it's almost like this, it has like a looping nature. In that as you delve deeper and deeper and deeper into the definition of you find that there are only more questions, and not that those questions necessarily return back to the original question, but in the same way that a fractal endlessly delves deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into similar structures, I believe that that's what we have here, except more of not in a visual or a geometric sense, but in a philosophical sense, in that there is always another question following the answer. So let's move on to the question that Destiny asks in his crisis.
Is it actually immoral to kill somebody in their sleep? Because if you go to sleep and you wake up, and it's essentially indistinguishable from some temporary death and resurrection, if you kill somebody while they're sleeping and they're not having a conscious experience, is it actually like wrong at all?
Is it immoral to kill someone who is sleeping? Assumption. So in order to make this argument, we have to make a lot of assumptions, because if we don't make these assumptions, then the problem is with the word immoral, right? So there's so many different ways that we can spin something as being morally correct or immoral. For instance, with this first assumption, there is no other reason to kill this person other than our own desire to. So let's say this person that we're going to kill is a rapist. Let's say that they've raped 3 million children. Let's say we have objective proof that they have raped 3 million children. Is it immoral to kill them in their sleep? I think that many people would argue yes. So we have an assumption that this person has done nothing wrong to us personally, so there is no other reason to kill this person other than our own desire to. So it is only coming out of our choice to kill this person, and there is no like pretext that they have done anything that we could even define as wrong towards our own personal individual existence as the person who's going to be killing this person. Okay. A second assumption, when we say immoral, and I think that this is the immoral that Destiny was talking about, we are referencing the impact our choice of action will have on the individual we are killing. So for instance, we could kill a man who is sleeping next to his family, and then his family could wake up to him being dead, right? Is it immoral to kill him? Yes, obviously, because we are causing a negative experience to be caused to a large amount of people for no reason than our own desire to. That, I think, is pretty clearly immoral. But if we start being curious about a person who is asleep, who then dies, is it immoral in the sense that from their perspective, to the sense of self for them, is it a bad or negative experience? And that's really, I think, the question that Destiny is asking, because it gets further into defining the question that he's really concerned about, but we'll get to that later. So another assumption that we have to have is that they die instantaneously. So the problem with not having this assumption is that there's a lot of difficult scenarios that we'd have to consider if we don't consider this. So for instance, if we kill them, but let's say it takes like a second to kill them, right? So you could argue that a second is enough time for the nerve endings, or however you kill them, right? So like, let's say you cut their head off and it takes you a second to cut their head off. Would they still experience something in that second? And if that's yes, then it kind of takes away from the sentiment of Destiny's question. I think that the question again is this very like, is it impacting this person whose presence of self or their sense of like being conscious is not currently there as we understand sleep to have that effect on us, right? So if they were to have any experience after we tried to kill them, any like timeline of experience, we could say that it dirties this philosophical question, because we want them to die instantaneously. We want them to have no chance at having any reaction to the death. It has to be instantaneous. So when we kill the person, they die so quickly that not even a single neuron can complete its transfer of information before the entirety of their body is removed from existence. Now I say entirety of their body just to be safe here, just to make sure that maybe if your foot exists, your state of consciousness can still exist somehow. It's just to prevent some bullshit edge cases. So then our next assumption and our last assumption for the main question is experience is definable and real. So we have to make this assumption because if we get into the, I don't know the right word, but I think it's metaphysics of whether or not experience actually exists or if it's even definable, then we can't really even have a discussion about our sense of self or a sense of identity as an individual experience. And even without that individual constraint on it, even just as an experience at all, we have to acknowledge that experience is a thing that at least you as an ego, at least me as a system that believes that it's something singular, has to acknowledge that there is experience that I am experiencing. And that is the assumption that we have to roll with here, because if we don't have that assumption, then a lot of our reality kind of falls apart. But let's move forward. So I start with, I make one simple claim, and then there's two different paths that we take depending on the definitions of what we use. Is it immoral to kill someone who is sleeping? My claim is that they are asleep, therefore their presence of self is not currently existing, therefore killing them has no effect on their experience and their self. Okay. So we haven't made any claims about morality yet, but this is the claim that I'm making, and then we're going to make some conclusions about the morality based upon the definitions of my claim. Okay, so definition of the presence of self, because I think that's the most most easily ambiguous term in this entire document, or in this entire claim here. Right, so we know what a sleep is, we know what they are, we know what all these different terms, but presence of self can definitely be argued one way or another. So presence of self, and I have two different definitions of presence of self. I have one here and I have one here. We're going to go through both. So for the first one, if presence of self is a specific individual system, or what we consider a human in this case, experiencing anything more than nothing at a discrete moment in time. Okay, so presence of self is any individual who's what we consider to be human, experiencing, right? And we've already assumed that an experience is possible and is definable, anything more than nothing at all at some discrete moment in time, right? So the discrete is important. This essentially means that we don't define necessarily a presence of self as a continuation over some timeline of some consistent self. Instead, it is simply the smallest sliver of time that you can break the universe down into fundamentally. If you could slice down to the smallest discrete point of time, separations of time, then at one of those times you have one presence of self, and then as time is changing you have different presence of self, but those presence of self are still valuable in that they are an experience happening to some individual human. Okay, so that's how we're defining presence of self in this claim. If we define it that way, that's what we're saying. Assuming that most humans experience more than nothing, so we must make this assumption because someone could also argue that I'm the only one who experiences anything, right? And if you make that argument, then killing someone in their sleep is not immoral because it doesn't affect them in any way because they don't exist, right? So we have to make the assumption that most humans experience more than nothing. Now I have all of my justification for it here. I'm not going to go over it, but the document will be linked in the video description. So if you would like to go through why I make these assumptions and how I came to these conclusions, you can take a look at the document and give me your thoughts on them. Most conscious, yeah, it should be most conscious. We also assume there's no presence of self during sleep. So that probably might have came up in some people's head. So they said, we said most conscious humans experience more than nothing. And then the counter to that could have been, well, what about in sleep? You experience nothing, right? We could argue that you experience nothing. Now, again, I go over the conclusions I make into how I made this assumption, but I make the assumption that there is no presence of self during sleep. That when we're asleep, it is akin to dying, in the same way that our cognition, our sense of self, or this definition, presence of self, is a specific individual system experiencing anything more than nothing at a discrete moment in time. So I am making the claim, the assumption, that when we are asleep, there is no experience happening. It is nothing. So the second part of this assumption is that we do not kill them when they are dreaming, because part of this assumption that I look into is, well, when you're dreaming, are you present of self? Like, is there a self there? Or is there an experience even at all? And I think that yes, when you're dreaming, there is some experience, there is some presence of self, even if you don't necessarily have choice in those dreams. Having any experience is more valuable than having no experience at all, is another claim that I make. Now I have to make this assumption, or not claim, assumption. I have to make this assumption because you can argue that having no experience or being dead is more valuable than being alive. And I think that, like, you could find many people who would think that being dead is better than being alive. And so I have to make the assumption that having any experience is more valuable than having no experience at all, because then I can start making moral claims, because I have some defined sense of value and what's good for humans, right? So finally, I can support the claim I made previously, which is they are asleep, therefore their presence of self is not currently existing, therefore killing them has no effect on their experience or self. Okay, so we support this claim given these assumptions are true, given our definition of presence of self is accurate to what I've described. We can claim morally, in terms of the person who is being killed, because they do not experience anything other than the same experience that they had, which is nothing, there is no negative impact on their immediate presence of self. Now I want to show how we can change this answer, this conclusion, simply by changing the definition of presence of self. So I think that an important consideration to make when we're talking about humans is that we are not discrete selves. I mean, that's kind of a philosophical claim to make, and I don't know if I'm gonna back myself up on it in the future. But I think that it's not too crazy to say that part of the human experience is that it is more than just one moment at a time. I think that we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty of some of the assumptions I make, but as like a broad statement, I think it is reasonable to say that the way that our brains process memories and time specifically changes our identities from a random, like, discrete moment-to-moment sense of self to a linear, elongated sense of self that has more than just a single discrete moment worth of identity. It's got an elongated sense of identity that hangs around and has commonalities throughout time.
I know I'm me because I remember being me. And I know that I'm me because there's some consistent, like, timeline of events that I can identify with. Like, how do I know that I'm me? Well, physically, I possess a body, and that's what I identify as physically. And then me is a concept I can identify because I remember things I've done. And I think even so, like, I think that a lot of the identities that we have are really just like strings of memories. So for instance, if I say like, oh, well, who am I? Well, like I play StarCraft. I'm not playing it right now. I did at one point in the past. It's like, oh, sure. I mean, like I talk to my friends. Well, I'm not right now, but I did in the past, right? Like, I think it feels like identity is like this kind of like stream of memories that you have, right?
So if we define presence of self as a specific individual system experiencing anything more than nothing, so just like we did before, except without the time stuff, and they have a consistent existence of that self. Okay, so we're adding on this term consistent existence. Now, we can define consistent existence in a bunch of different ways, right? Which is why it gets kind of tricky, like philosophically, and how it all breaks down. But I think I only go with one definition of consistent existence. I think if we had a different definition of consistent existence, we could argue different things. But I'm going to run with this one just because I was getting kind of bored with this problem. But let's move forward. So if consistent existence is defined as a repeated experience of presence of self over some period of time, so we have the presence of self, which we've defined here, and it's kind of dumb of me the way that I did this. So basically, the definition of presence of self includes consistent existence in this case, and then I'm defining consistent existence with presence of self. So kind of moronic on my part, but I think that it conveys what I'm trying to get at here with consistent existence, because they're one and the same when we define them this way. So presence of self is consistent existence, and consistent existence is presence of self. It is only adding on to the previous statement of presence of self that there is some period of time through which or over which that presence of self exists, right? So the claim here is that presence of self is not a discrete moment in time, but rather it is a elongated span of time of multiple moments that makes up a single sense of self. And if we run with that assumption, then with that definition, I should say, rather, then we can start making some different claims and some different conclusions. So, assumption, if we know that they will wake up eventually, so we know they're not terminal, we know they're not in a coma, we know that they're most likely, most probably going to wake up the next morning. Okay, and I think that we can make this assumption safely. I think that if you found someone asleep, you would bet a lot of money that they're going to wake up. Like any random ass person, you would bet a decent amount of money that they would wake up. That's just like an easy assumption to make. Okay, and there is no presence of self during sleep, and we do not kill them when they are dreaming. We don't necessarily need this one because we make a different conclusion, but there is no presence of self during sleep. So what we're saying is presence of self is an elongated sense of continuous existence, but during sleep, that continuous existence stops, right? So we are saying that there is no presence of self during sleep. So you don't exist during sleep, okay? We're also saying having any experience is more valuable than having any experience at all, as again, we have to justify some moral claim here, so we have to have some kind of system of value. We do not support the claim. We don't because you are depriving them from future presence of self, right? If we assume that they're going to wake up eventually, and we assume that having any experience is more valuable than having any experience at all, and we define the presence of self as an elongated sense or an elongated existence over some period of time, then just because there is a gap in that period of time does not mean that the next extended period of presence of self is not as valid as the last, or as valuable, I should say, rather. And so because of that, when we kill them, it deprives another presence of self, or you can think of it as like the possibility of presence of self that we are assuming is going to happen with certainty, right? Like we know they're going to wake up, so there's going to be another presence of self. So we're depriving them of a consistent existence or experience in the future. Having any experience is more valuable than having no experience, and so therefore, depriving a presence of self from its consistent experience is immoral. Now again, I know it's kind of moronic where I'm using justifications of definitions that essentially mean one another. Like it's kind of, I don't know. I'd have to think more about that, but I think that it conveys what I'm trying to get at here. So that kind of answers a very specific subset of assumptions going into this problem, but I think it touches on and kind of flushes out a lot of the philosophical questions that we have to have going into a question like this. Is it immoral to kill someone who is sleeping? Well, it depends on your moral system. It depends on the assumptions you make. It depends on your concepts of what experience is, what identity is, what self is, how continuous it is, whether it's discrete, all sorts of different things. So yeah, that's my little analysis of the problem so far. But let's get further into what Destiny specifically, I think, was trying to get at. So he brings up this clone problem. How do we determine which clone we are in this scenario? So the scenario is,
let's say that somebody puts you in a room and they are able to clone you perfectly, 1-to-1. Say that the room is dark, so neither person can see their position, right? So you go in and you come out and there are 2 of you, right? How the fuck could you ever determine which one is you? Like, would there be, like...
I make a claim here. Having a distinct sense of individual self is inherent to human experience. So this doesn't answer it completely, but I think it gets to the answer eventually. So therefore, for the individual clones, it does not matter. You would not be able to tell. That is the answer, right? That's like an objective answer. If someone asked you, how do you know that you are not the clone? You wouldn't. You just would not. It's not possible that you'd be able to tell. Now, this is a claim that might not be true, just as any other claim might not be. But I would believe this to be true through my own reasoning that if we define these clones as perfectly copied, in that all the way down to the smallest indivisible piece of the universe, they are the exact same. The only difference between these 2 individuals from our understanding of the universe, right? Like maybe there's more that we don't understand about consciousness or existence. They would be indistinguishable from one another. And the experience that existed within them would probably be very similar up to and about the moments where they had different experiences. But again, this is one of those questions where there is no answer, right? It's just like that question of like, who are you? There's really no question, or there's really no like objective answer, because when we ask who are you, we're talking about a single thing. And yet in reality, there is no single thing of which we're talking about. It is a massive complex system that is transient in nature, and that means essentially that it has no discrete state at any given time, and to define it in any way only opens yourself up to finding like an endless series of definitions, right? So to define something, you have to define how you define it. You have to define the words that you use, and you can continually define those words in ad infinitum. Ad infinitum? Ad infinite. I don't know. Infinitely is what I'm trying to say. But we can look at other perspectives, and I think that's also kind of useful in this kind of problem. From an outside perspective, if we did not track the position of the clones throughout the process, and we assume perfect material cloning down to the smallest traceable marker, it's kind of what we're talking about, the smallest discrete place, or at least like what we can even tell the difference between, like particle-wise, then the ship of Theseus problem applies here. So the ship of Theseus is the problem of if you take a ship and you replace every single piece on that ship with a perfect copy of that piece. So like you take apart, like you take the floorboard off and then you replace it with like another floorboard. And then you do that for every single piece on the entire ship. Is it still the same ship, right? Now this obviously, this question comes down to your definition of what that original ship was. And it has an infinite number of answers, right? Like there is no actual objective answer here. It is a question that is only answered by our own willingness to define what makes one discrete form any different any different than another copy of that discrete form. Again, this question has an infinite number of answers depending on your assumptions, which results in an infinite number of questions to be further asked about. There is no objective answer here. So I did some defining of this statement just to make it a little clearer. Individual in this case, I'm saying there is no separate conscious force inside of your experience. So there is no other, when I define conscious force here too, because like, look at all these definitions, because then I have to define feel, right? So when I use these little markers, it means that a word that has like a million different meanings, it has an infinite number of meanings, and so there's no answer really. So we say conscious force is the tendency for our encompassing experience to feel as though we are directing it, right? As though a single existence is directing our own thoughts and feelings. And then we define inside in this case as the boundaries of our own personal experience. So I can't experience what you're experiencing simply through the nature of how the universe works, how our minds are connected, and how our systems interact with one another. So I can experience echoes of what you felt, Like you can tell me something, and that is a feeling that is then put into a thought, that is then put into the air, that is then put into my ear, that is then put into a thought, that is then put into a feeling. Right? All right, anyways. So then he went through some more scenarios.
My question would be like, what's the difference between you waking up versus you waking up as a clone, right? So let's say for instance, let's say that you go to sleep, and while you're sleeping, let's say that 2 clones are made of you and 3 people awaken the next day, right? For the 3 people that awaken, like you and your 2 clones, none of you really knows, which one was the original, because you have no way of knowing. Physically, you're identical and you contain the same like string of memories.
How do you know if you're the original, right? This is very similar to the question before. But I think a better question is, why does it matter? Right? I think I've already pounded into the ground that some of these questions, they just don't have any answer. There's no objective truth to any of this. There's no way of finding out what is true, because all these definitions of you are ambiguous and slippery and impossible to define. So why should we ask this question, right? And if we had some kind of answer, would it even matter, right? So let's say you fell asleep and then you woke up and suddenly there was 3 of you, right? 2 of you are clones, 1 of you is the original. Oh, fuck, right? But if we were legislating, or if we were interacting with, like, say we're a separate friend interacting with these 3 clones, or 2 clones and 1 original, right? It might change the way we see it if we know who's the original. But even then, to make any moral claims about how we should act towards the 3 individuals separately, right? Like if we should treat the original differently than the 3, I think is a really interesting question. But again, I think it falls on questions that can't really be answered. But I think my clear understanding from my what I would do in real life if this was to possibly happen, and I was some outsider who had a friend who got cloned twice and didn't know which one he was, I would treat each individual as a separate individual, I would imagine. And I think that that's just how the reality of the situation would play out. Now, for how we still haven't gotten to what Destiny is actually getting at yet. And I think that we're getting there, but this is kind of just like some food for thought right now. So I just gave some different perspectives on what would happen. For the clones, there'd be no impact on your own sense of experience. So for each clone, they'd be having a very distinct individual sense of being you, right? Like even if you were the original, the clones would still believe that they were the original and would believe it just as much as you did. It would be distressing, but it would not be world altering. I think that if this was an isolated event and somehow 2 of you just poofed out of existence or into existence, I don't think that anything too... Like, I don't think that your own internal sense of existence would change in any significant way. I don't think that there's some connecting force between those 2 things. And that's getting a lot closer to, I think, what Destiny was talking about. Immediate friends and family, of course, it'd be confusing as fuck. It'd be super fucking stressful. They gotta deal with 3 of me now. Holy fuck, I feel bad for them. And then society, again, if it's only an isolated moment where like somehow we get 3 of the same person, or like maybe there's like a whole town that gets cloned, I don't think that's that big of a deal. It'd be a really cool oddity. It'd be like this crazy thing that happened, but then society would continue on. Each clone would have its own identity by like the end of like a week or 2. I think it would be, yeah, I don't know. They would devolve into the individuals that, like they would devolve into their own individuality very quickly, very, very quickly, I believe. All right. So here's a really interesting scenario that I think covers exactly what Destiny is trying to get at.
Let's say that like one person goes to sleep. Let's say that you clone this person. Then let's say that you kill the original person, and then the clone wakes up.
So from the perspective of the original person, you're dead, right? Like that experience, you went from an experience of something to an experience of nothing, even though you were already an experience of nothing, right? So you went to sleep and you just didn't wake up. Now, if you're a clone, you are alive, and from the clone's perspective, have always been alive, right? You went to sleep and then you woke up. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens here when we think about it, right? Did you actually die? Right? Because you went to sleep and then you died, like your physical body was removed from existence in its form, right? Like as it, obviously, like the atoms didn't just disappear, but the combination of material that makes you is no longer of that same form. But some other distinct materials or atoms or whatever matter is taking the exact form that you did as you laid in bed. And then it woke up. Is that separate from you? It ties into what are we, right? Like what is consciousness more so than just like a system in our brain? Is it consistent throughout space and time in a way that allows it to persist even from one arrangement or form into another arrangement or form? Now, these are kind of difficult, asinine questions that don't have answers, just as any of these other questions don't, right? But it's a very interesting concept once you kind of feel it for yourself, I think. So I make this is the realization that I had when I was going through it again and again and again, trying to make sure that I had what Destiny was saying correct. And I think that this is kind of the sentiment that he's getting at in words, although it's not perfect, but I think it's pretty close. Is there consistency to the same presence of self, right? Do they connect in some way? This is the perfect scenario that outlines this. If you're killed in your sleep, but there's a perfect clone of yourself, have you really died? In the same way that if you fall asleep, your presence of self stops, and then you wake up and you are alive again. Now, this is something that I have thought about when I was younger, this concept itself, not in this scenario specifically, but I know that I came to the conclusion myself that yes, sleep is death.
If you go to sleep and then you wake up in the morning, my question is that, like, is stopping that stream of memory, is halting your conscious experience, is that like essentially dying? When you wake up, right, have you essentially been dead for some point of time, right?
When I go to sleep, how I define like myself, is it's temporal. So, God, when I say temporal, I mean that there is an association, a strong, almost tangible association with the person that I am within the brief moments around me. So the last, like, let's say some arbitrary number of like the last 2 seconds, right? So I would point to the last 2 seconds that I have been as myself, as my presence of self, even though it's like we could sliver it down to the very distinct quantitative fraction of time that exists at the very like bottom of time and space itself, right? We could say that at one little sliver I exist as a self, but I think that our brains function just like any other system in the universe, in that they take time to get to where they're going. And so I think that this feeling and this sense of self requires a certain amount of time in order to actually exist in the way that it does. And then our brain does the work to make that sense of continuation into an illusion that feels how it does now. I like to think of it like this. When I was 12, was I the person that I am today? No, obviously not. The difference between me now, 24 years old, and me when I was 12 years old is the same difference temporally, right? So the difference in time between me and myself when I'm 24 and myself when I'm 12, as spatially the difference between some other individual on this planet right now, right? So there's some 12-year-old or there's some 24-year-old out there living today, right now, or just any person at all, the age doesn't matter, who is close enough to me, personality-wise, visually, some any kind of definition, right? They're close enough in that regard to me as I am to when I was 12. And we still consider those two people today who are currently existing, me and this other person, as distinct individuals, right? So I would argue that my 12-year-old self is a distinct individual who is separate from my 24-year-old self. Now, we can keep closing the gap on these timelines, but I think at a certain point, myself is locally temporal in that, like I said, there's like a 2-second, 5-second sense of self that has to exist simply by the fact that our brains do not happen instantaneously. Our processes of existence and the illusion of self and identity doesn't happen instantaneously. It happens over time, and that time requires it to not happen at that little sliver of fraction of existence. But I could be wrong. So that is a really interesting concept of like what we are as an individual, and I think that it helps us realize that like the sense of like singularness, the sense of like experience as one whole form really isn't true, in that we're always changing, we're always different, and we as a concept, like when I say we, I mean like me, myself as an individual, is more of a well, what it is, like the way I think of it, it's a system that is convinced that it is a single thing. And it's a very convincing illusion. It seems like I am one thing, but because of the complexity of our systems, I don't think that we'd be able to function very well in other ways. I think that the illusion of ego, the illusion of being a singular entity, is very useful in survival. So if you want to be like an evolution nerd and think about the forces that caused us to become how we are, I think that some motherfucker one day woke up and was like, man, I'm me. And then he survived a lot better than the other motherfucker who was like, I am the entire universe. And now we're all a bunch of me's, But anyways, yeah, I make some claims about this. Let's just go through those real quick, and then I'll finish this up. So given that we fall asleep, we're halting our presence of self. How do we reconnect with our future presence of self, right? Is there something tying our presence of self previously to our future presence of self when we wake up? Clearly there is something, I make the claim, or an illusion, that's what I believe it more to be, that takes our previous presence of self and pushes it into the future, right? So our current configuration of our brain, we fall asleep, and then some time passes, it changes just a little bit, and then we wake up, but it's close enough to our past configuration of our brain, the position and like the sense of time for us as an existence, it changes so slightly, but it does change, but so slightly in a way that it allows us to connect easily. I think that what would be really jarring is if we were somehow able to turn off our consciousness for a little bit, but we changed our brain, right? So we changed the system that makes up who we are, because I think that you would wake up with a massive identity crisis. You wouldn't know who the fuck you were. You wouldn't know to trust any of the memories or like your senses of anything, really. You would be very lost. Yeah. I make a claim here. It is more probable that presence of self as a continuous process is an illusion of how our minds processes events. A functioning mind is a persistent system at any given point in time, and part of that system's function is that it provides a sense of persistence. This persistence in reality does not exist, as can be seen by the clone problems, right? So the claim here is that our form as we stand right now, like when I say form, I mean like the combination and the specific like alignment of all the material that makes up our bodies, or more specifically our brains, is what gives us the sense of persistence, right? I believe that I have been at this chair making this video for the last 20 minutes because my brain has memories of that, and so it gives me a sense of persistence, when in reality I could have just popped into existence here at any moment with these memories, but it would feel the exact same no matter what. And so this sense of persistence of self is an illusion. But yeah, another claim here: experience as we understand it happens to what we define as an individual presence of self. So long as this presence of self exists, you exist, right? So as long as that presence of self exists, or like existence itself, then you exist. But that you, so we can define you any way we want, define arbitrarily. It can have not happened at all and yet still exist. So when I say this, it cannot have happened at all and yet still exist. What I'm saying with that is the same thing that I just said, right? I could have just poofed into existence and suddenly I am super fucking certain that this is like what's been happening. I can think back to when I was a kid. I have all these ideas of like linear reality and how, like, you know, through time it's just progressed in a way that's allowed me to like grow and continue in a very like consistent manner throughout my life, when in reality it could be completely different. We could be jumping around from different experiences and not even know it, but because our mind gives us this illusion of a central consistent train moving forward in a linear way, we react and make actions based upon that illusion. I think illusion is kind of the wrong word here, because it's not necessarily proof that it's an illusion. It could be just reality, but I think, again, we're getting into questions that have no answers. There's no objective truth here. It's really just kind of a phenomenon of really complicated systems, which is what our brain is. But yeah, I kind of make that claim here, but the poofing into existence. And then I had some other questions that I thought were really interesting. Not particularly related, but I think they're, I don't know, interesting questions nonetheless. We'll end it with this. So if we were able to connect two individuals together through like their heads, their thoughts, would they appear to be separate, or would they think as one conscious force? Right. And I defined conscious force earlier in the document, so if you want a definition for that, it's up ahead, or it's in the document. I claim it depends on how we connect them, right? I think that we're already connected. Right now, I am connecting with you. My feelings are turning into thoughts, which are turning into sound waves, which are turning into, what is it? It's analog data, which then becomes digital data, which then becomes oh my God. I took signals and systems, and then it becomes like a Wi-Fi signal, and then it becomes yada, yada, yada. It goes on and on and on into a signal until it comes out of your speakers or your headphones or whatever. And then it comes into your head, it's thoughts, and then it's a feeling, right? So we are already connected in a way. But if we start connecting, let's say, neurons to each other, I don't know if neurons is the right word, but the brain matter from one individual to another in an intelligent way, right? So like we connect my visual cortex to your visual cortex in a way that like doesn't, I don't know, if we could do that. My claim is that as we connect them more and more and more, the more single they would become, the more they would realize that they're not a separate entity, but rather they are a single system. And I think that is just a property of complex systems. Once you get them interacting in a certain way to where it is indistinguishable which one is driving the controls, then it essentially just becomes one system. And I think that is like the transcendental property of really complex systems, i.e. like human consciousness, is that as you get really, 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 really complex, and as you allow iteration of rational thought over time, you get an output of singular decision making, right? Like the system converges to a state of what we have now, which is our ego, our sense of self, our sense of what we are. But yeah, who knows? Second question is, furthermore, if the clone situation was applied here and we had perfect copies of two people and we connected their minds, would they interact as separate entities? Now, again, I think that like as you connect their minds more and more and more, they would become single eventually. But I think it would happen more quickly for the clones, because even if you were just like hearing your clone think, it would be very similar to your own thoughts, and you could almost argue that it is the same thoughts. It's the same hardware, the same process is happening. It's just happening in parallel. But yeah. Anyways, I appreciate it. If you made it all the way through the video, please subscribe or follow me on Twitch. I'm going to be streaming every Wednesday from 4 to 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. But yeah, I always enjoy questions. I always enjoy discussion. So if you think that I went through any of this wrong, or if you've got some contentions to my assumptions or my claims, hit me up, let me know. And I hope you like goats. Bye-bye.